things that don't happen smoothly can actually affect the deal. And you can actually lose the deal just because the money didn't get here and then someone else comes in, swoops in, and takes the deal away from you.
Offers a bit more.
Yeah. Shalom from Jerusalem. My name is Shlomo Ben Zakan. I'm the CEO of Remax Momentum. Today I'm really excited to have with us in our studio Yaacov Epstein, great lawyer, worked with him on several deals, and we're here to give you a lot of information, especially for people who are interested in purchasing in Israel, and especially in Jerusalem area. If you're from outside of Israel, you're from America, Canada, Australia, South Africa, English speakers, this is the podcast that you want to watch and you want to really understand. So let's get right to it. First of all, introduce yourself. Tell us about you, where you come from, what's your background, your education, and what you do right now.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I appreciate it. My name is Yaacov Epstein. I'm an Israeli lawyer. In addition to that, I also have a degree in law, of course, and marketing. In the past 10 years, I've been dealing with overseas buyers for purchasing out of Israel here in Israel. And my job, my goal is basically to hold their hand throughout the process, explain to them the difference, explain to them how it works here, ensure their safety until we go through the whole process of purchasing and registering their apartment on their name. The most important thing that I tell my clients is it's different. It's really different than what you're used to back at home. In addition, a bit about myself a bit more. I've been building the last few years a few hundreds of residential apartments in Beit Shemesh, and therefore when I hold my hand to clients, I give them the experience that I have both as a builder and as a real estate lawyer.
Okay, so now say someone's interested in purchasing something in Israel and they haven't a clue. They don't know the first thing about the process in Israel. They know America because in America you have contract and closing. Here it's different. Let's start at least with taxation, okay? What are the differences between America and in Israel, and how does taxation work here, purchase tax in particular?
Very good. So in Israel, when you purchase a property, you have to pay purchase tax, which means basically it's a tax based on the value of the property, based on value based on the purchase price of the property.
Yes.
And value. It depends. If the value is higher than what you purchase, you might be paying on the value, not the purchase, and vice versa. In any case, purchase tax is as a percentage, and there's a few brackets. For Israelis, the bracket is actually a lower bracket. When I say Israelis, I mean residents of Israel. Because in Israel, taxation is based on residency. So therefore, an Israeli resident will be paying a lower bracket, while a non-resident will be paying a higher bracket. We might have, for example, an American citizen living in Israel, non-Israeli, but he will be considered an Israeli resident, and they will enjoy the lower bracket. While we might have an Israeli living in Manhattan, for example, who will be purchasing in Israel and be paying the higher bracket. In addition, we have to know that also for Israelis, when they buy a second property, they have to pay the higher bracket. And again, when I say Israelis, Israeli residents.
Okay. So what are the brackets? Let's say someone has a Tudat Zehut. They have Israeli ID, okay? And this is their first property, their only property they're purchasing. What are the general brackets of how much taxation?
Very good. So the first thing I would do is I would check if they are residents of Israel. The fact that they have an Israeli Tudat Zehut, Israeli ID, does not mean that they'll be taxed in the lower level. If they are an Israeli resident, so then Israeli residents will be paying up to zero taxes for the sum between 0 to 1.8 million shekels. And then then for the sum above it, till about 2.1, it's 3.5%. Above that, it's 5%. And eventually around 4 or 5 million shekels, it goes up to 8%. And at a certain stage, it goes up to 10%. While non-Israeli residents will be paying 8% from the first shekel until about 5-point-something million shekels, and above that, 10%.
Okay, and there are some areas actually where they can get away without paying any taxes legally.
Yes.
Talk about that. Where
Yes.
would that be?
So if you buy beyond the green line, you can, and you're not an Israeli resident or Israeli citizen, you do not have to pay purchase tax. We did not yet talk about capital gains, but they also do not have to pay capital gains when selling. Or if you have any income on rent, you also don't have to pay on that. Basically, when you buy beyond the green line, you're like any other Palestinian who lives in Palestinian territories who do not have to pay taxes to Israel. So do you. If you do not, so do you. If you are not Israeli, not citizen, Israeli resident either, you won't have to pay taxes when you purchase or sell in Israel.
That's amazing. So, in the Jerusalem area, that would include Ma'ale Adumim, that would include Gush Etzion, Kochav Yaakov, Tel Zion, even Givat Zev, right? Givat Zev is outside the green line. Ramat Givat Zev, for instance, it's a brand new neighborhood, and if you purchase and you are purchasing as a foreigner, you don't have a Tudat Zot, you pay 0 taxes.
Right.
Pretty cool.
Correct. Because, again, beyond the green line, non-Israeli resident.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's get into the other side of it, capital gains. You know, there's capital gains, Israeli capital gains, which we call mas shevach, and there's also capital gains in America. So if someone owns a property here in Israel, they're not an Israeli citizen, and they're selling right now. What are the implications, tax implications, as far as capital gains on both sides?
It's a very good question. So in Israel, capital gain tax is 25% of your gains. If you do not own another property in the country that you're residing in, you might be able to avoid paying capital gain tax here in Israel. If you do own another property and you're subject to paying capital gain tax in Israel, basically you'll have to pay 25% of your gains. So a simple example, if you bought for 2 million shekels, you sold for 3, your gains is 1 million, you'll be paying 250,000 shekels capital gains. Now, of course, that's a simplified example because I can deduct from your gains different expenses you had related to the purchase or sale. Real estate agent, that's deductible. It's worth investing. It makes it cheaper, basically.
Lawyer, and a lawyer's fee.
Lawyer's fee for purchasing, for selling. If you upgrade the apartment, added a kitchen, added air conditioning, whatever. When I sit down with my client, I'll discuss with him, and we'll try to maximize the amount of expenses that we can that are recognized, and therefore ensure
to lower your exposure to the capital gains taxes.
Exactly, and therefore my client will be paying less taxes.
Fantastic. Okay, so now let's get into purchase tax. When it's different in America, here again you have contract and closing, and actually let's talk a little about that in connection with afterwards with the taxes. Okay, what are the major differences between America and Israel in terms of there you have contract and closing, here you got what is the difference? And then, of course, right after that, please get into if someone purchased a property, when do they have to pay the taxes, the sales tax?
Okay, I'll start with basically you're talking about an extremely important point that is different in Israel than what my clients are used to, and basically that also represents everything that's different in Israel. The whole process here in Israel is a lot more complicated, detailed. It extends for many, many months, usually from beginning to end. I'm talking not even for negotiations, just from the day of signing until you purchase it. And therefore, there's a gap here of understanding the Israeli culture, Israeli system, and therefore that's where I come in to help my clients and ensure that they understand what they're getting into, understand the process, and ensure that they will obey and won't get into a breach. Regarding taxes, in Israel, closing is actually when you sign the contract. Yes, 3-4 months later you're done paying and then you'll receive possession, but actually the day you sign is the day you're committed to buy. There's no backing out. If you do, you might have a 10% penalty or maybe more or less, depends what kind of damage was created to the seller because of you. I barely ever had a contract where we had a mortgage clause. You have to check your mortgage before you. Even if you don't get a mortgage, you have to go ahead and buy.
If something happens and I don't get a mortgage after I sign contract, what happens?
You're obligated to pay. You're in a tough situation.
So if I don't have the money, let's say it was a 2 million shekel purchase, and I put down 10% or 20% by the contract, and I was expecting to get 70%, let's say, from the mortgage, and it doesn't happen. What happens to the money I put down?
You might be losing 10% or more. It depends on the penalty that was decided in the contract. I wouldn't want to be in that situation. Wow. So therefore, with my clients, that part of the pre-signing contract checks, we will check about the mortgage. We'll discuss it. We might do a pre-appraisal
yes. Pre-approval, pre-appraisal, even.
Exactly. Check everything in advance. Now, you asked about when do you have to pay taxes in
Yeah,
Israel.
yeah. When do you pay tax? Like how much time after the contract? Is it like when you take possession?
So that's what's different here in Israel. In Israel, once you sign the contract, you're obligated to pay the taxes within 60 days. You're obligated to pay the next day, but they give you up to 60 days. After that, you will be receiving penalties, interest if you do not pay. Now, there are ways of delaying and pushing it off, but there will be an interest, and it depends. There are different situations, like if you didn't get if you're selling, so you haven't received a certain percentage of the property, you can delay it. If you're purchasing, again, if you haven't paid. But at the end of the day, you have to pay right away. And it happens, and it surprises many of my clients who buy, let's say, on paper. They buy now, they sign out for a contract of 3 million shekels, and they'll be receiving the property in 3 years. But they have to pay within 60 days all the taxes.
Wow. So
Same for capital gains.
So if I'm buying a property that's taking another 2-3 years to build, I got to pay the taxes now.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So very important, guys. Take that into account, because it's not just the money you put down at the contract. It's also the taxes that you have to make sure that you have. Otherwise, you could be in trouble. Yeah.
Yeah. Before we get into the contract, I sit down with my clients, and we review all the expenses related to the purchase. When do they have to pay it? That they should be aware and ready, and transfer the money to Israel in order to be to have the funds available to pay their different expenses. My clients should expect, if they're not Israeli residents, they should expect 12, 13, 14% additional expenses beyond the price of the property.
Just think of those closing fees, okay? Something like that. Okay, so now, olim chadashim, okay, new olim. What are the special benefits that they get? And how much time do they have after they do the contract? Do they keep those benefits? Yeah.
So I'll be discussing the Oleh Chadash benefits regarding purchase tax. So when, up from a year before you make Aliyah, if you bought a property for a year before you made Aliyah, up to 7 years after making Aliyah, you could use an Oleh Chadash benefit, which lowers your taxes, lowers your purchase tax. Now, it should be understood that the benefit was instated many years ago, and since then, the taxes for Israeli residents have changed, and therefore the Israeli resident taxes are actually lower than the Oleh Chadash benefits. So it's not always worth using your Oleh Chadash benefits. Mm-hmm. I would only use it if your property is around 4.5 to 5 million shekels or above. And also then, I would discuss with my clients if it's worth using it, even if you use your Israeli residency benefit, and you might be paying more, you might want to use your Oleh Chadash benefits and keep onto it until you might be buying a second property, where your savings and taxes will be a lot greater, because Israeli citizens, Israeli residents, who buy a second property are subject to a high level of taxes of 8%, while Oleh Chadash benefit is lower.
It's interesting. So it's not just the first property you get, you purchase, it could also be the second property as well. Okay, fantastic. So now let's get into transferring money to Israel. And that's a big can of worms, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. Like, what's the best way? Is there a best way?
Okay, once a signed client signs on, the first topic I'll be discussing with them is, how are you transferring money to Israel? In the past, a few years ago, you used to just click or call your banker, transfer the money, 2 to 3 days later it would be in the bank in Israel, everything would be fine. But since the last few years, the Israeli banks have really tightened all the regulation regarding transferring to money in Israel because of laundering money, or Israeli laundering money. Therefore, it became very difficult in transferring money to Israel. It's not the actual transfer, it's the proving the bank that the money is kosher, there's no laundering money in it. The bank will require you to provide different documentation proving that all the taxes were paid in the source of the country of the source of the funds, for example, the United States, that you're not laundering money. They will have me sign some documentation, or a lawyer in America. They will have your accountant in America sign a document that everything's kosher. It's not easy, and if they're not satisfied with your answers or with the documents, they might just send the money back, and that happened to my clients. So that's something you have to be aware of. And there are a few solutions. First of all, if you're aware of this in advance and you prepare yourself, you can get through. In addition, there are 3 methods of transferring money to Israel. You can transfer bank to bank, which is usually the safest method the most expensive. The Israeli banks will charge
It's
you a
probably
lot.
the easiest, maybe. I don't know, maybe.
It's easiest
Yeah.
as a transfer.
Yeah, but the question's on the other end. I mean, to show proofs from here to tomorrow, it's
You
not
cannot reach
simple.
the bankers. They don't respond.
Yeah.
Takes them 3 days.
I've had several times where they just sent the money back, and then it set us back another few weeks, and
Exactly.
not a good situation.
So that's and they're more expensive. So not bank is not always the first option. The second option is usually Israeli forex companies, who are actually responsive. You could reach them by WhatsApp, by email, by phone. They answer right away. They will help you through the process with a smile, and you'll be able to provide the right documentation. And they're cheaper, so the client saves. So the problem is they're private companies, so you have some kind of risk factor that if something happens to the company, if they go under while the money is by them, you're taking some kind of risk. But at the end of the day, I would tell you that most of my clients use the private companies. In addition, there's another method. You could use forex companies that are non-Israelis, and they might give you even a better rate than the Israeli ones. But the problem is, once the money hits Israel, you're back to stage one. You have to prove that it's kosher, accountant letters, etc. Now, if you're buying from a contractor on paper apartment, you cannot use forex companies that are non-Israelis, because the only way to pay the company is using a bank slip, which you could only do here physically in Israel with a company that has an account here in Israel. So that's something that I discuss with my clients right away, because it takes weeks until the money arrives. Many times this will delay the signing because the money didn't arrive, the letters, the accountants, they didn't clear yet, so we'll wait until the money's clear to sign the contract.
Yeah, and things that don't happen smoothly can actually affect the deal. You can actually lose the deal just because the money didn't get here, and then someone else comes in, swoops in, and takes the deal away from you.
A bit more.
Yeah, so you want to make sure that it's handled properly. You want to make sure that someone's helping you do that knows what they're doing, and don't just shoot in the dark. It's dangerous. You could lose your dream house. Okay.
I had friends, colleagues who called me that their clients were transferring money to Israel, and they weren't able to transfer. They weren't able to clear their money, and they were late in their payment, and we're getting penalties or breach of contract, and that's very risky and costs money. You should use someone who has experience in transferring money, experience in this area. It's not worth risking it.
And what about opening bank accounts? Like, is there a thing about opening up a bank account in Israel? Is that help at all, or is that the right way to go?
So if my clients are not planning on taking a mortgage, they'll be financing the money by taking, let's say, a local mortgage or loan in the country where they reside. So you can actually use one of these local forex companies, and you will not need a bank account. But eventually, it's smart to have a bank account. But if you're taking a mortgage, there's a need of having a bank account. And usually when my clients come to Israel to look for an apartment, I will recommend one of the things you have to do while searching for an apartment is open up an account. It's needed for later on. It's needed for your mortgage. That's a must. And then also all the utilities. I can have the different companies withdraw money from your account and have everything smooth in a process, and that way it will help you in the future.
Okay, so say someone can't get here, Corona or who knows what, okay, and is there a way for him to open up a bank account without him being here?
The answer is yes. I do that many times for my clients. Sometimes it's done by the mortgage broker, sometimes it's done by me. Depends on the need, and it depends when and how the whole deal is structured, and when do we need the account open.
Okay, so they would have to effectively send you a power of attorney or something like that?
I will say it's not an easy process for me to open up an account for a third party. The banks here are very specific about the regulations of the documentation. I will have my client sign a power of attorney, all the documents needed to open. I would even have them send it a few times in that way in case there's a need. And then it's a process. It might take a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks until you get to the bank, until the bank allows you to come and submit the documentation. But yeah, that's part of a service that I offer to my clients.
Okay, so getting from all this that the earlier you start doing things, the better it is all in the long run. Okay, so let's talk about rental. Okay, rental. So people that own properties here for years and they're collecting rent. They're Americans, let's say. They don't have an Israeli ID. What are the tax ramifications?
So there's actually two ramifications. The first one is you have to pay taxes on rent in Israel, but we'll get into the but in a moment. The second is when you sell the property, you might have to pay higher capital gain tax when selling if you rented it. For every year you rented, you'll have to pay like 2% on the value of the property. It depreciates the value of the property, and therefore your gain is higher and you'll be paying higher taxes. But I'm not going to discuss that in depth. It's a whole different topic. Let's talk about the direct taxes on rent. There's three different ways, you can choose between three ways of paying taxes on rent. The first one is if you're renting less than 5,000 shekels, around 5,000, you do not have to pay taxes on it. You can report it, but no taxes have to be paid. The second option is you can decide also from the first shekel, or if the value or the rent is more than 5,000 shekels, you can pay a flat 10% on taxes on the income. So if you're renting out for 10,000 shekels, you'll be paying 1,000 shekels a month taxes, and that's it. It's actually very low. The third option is all of the income can be subject to your personal taxation as if it's your income, and based on your personal situation, you'll be taxed. It might be lower, it might be more. You'll work it out with your accountant, or we can discuss and see if it's worth it.
So it could go by your tax bracket, or it could go by a set amount. There's different options, and not the same is not what's good for this one is not good for that one. Everyone has their own situation. Okay.
Now, of course, if someone's non-Israeli and non-resident buying beyond the green line, they do not have to pay taxes at all for their rent.
So they don't pay taxes for the purchase, they don't pay taxes for the sale, and they don't pay taxes for any rent.
Correct.
That's amazing. Okay. So that's a lot of information. I think that's we're already running out of time. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for coming by again. This has been a learning experience. I hope this helped you guys out there that are interested in purchasing properties in Israel. I highly recommend that when you looking to purchase, first that you find a great lawyer that's going to help you, that's going to hold your hand throughout the process. That English speaker, which I highly recommend, Yaacov Epstein. I've done several deals with him, and he's really great. And also make sure that you have a good agent. I mean, if you doesn't have to be us, obviously. I'm saying pick a good agent that's going to help you through the process, because it's not just there's legal, and there's also a lot of other stuff that goes on in terms of checking
gap.
Right, culture. There's differences, and a lot of Americans are shocked. I have to pay separate for the agent. Yeah, things are different here, and it's important to understand it from the get-go how things work here, because once you know how things work, then you won't be shocked, you won't be surprised, and you'll just expect what's going to happen. And in terms of what Yaakov spoke about, in terms of knowing from the get-go that you have taxation. You have a certain amount that you're going to have to put down for the contract. You have other expenses. What would you say a rule of thumb is to add to the price of the house?
For non-residents of Israel, it's around 12, 13, 14% beyond the purchase price.
So take that into account as well. So you have the price of your house plus another 14%, which will take care of all your closing fees. Okay, great. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you again, Yaakov, and I'd love to have you again. And there's a lot of subjects that we could speak about more in depth.
Yeah.
And thank you guys for joining us and spending all this time with us, because this has been a little longer than usual. But if you're here, if you're still stuck around, that means this was relevant information for you, and hopefully this will help you in your purchasing process. And thank you again. Shalom from Yerushalayim. And if you need to speak to Yaakov, by the way, you can get a hold of him. How would they find you?
Information below.
Information below in YouTube. Put our information as well. From Remax Momentum, Shlomo Ben Zaken. See you next time. Shalom from Jerusalem.